The sea whispered secrets of betrayal beneath skies heavy with gold and sorrow. A humble seamstress named Angelina Hartwell was cast out in disgrace, accused of a theft she didn't commit, stripped of her honor, and left alone in a world ruled by power and appearances. But fate had other plans. That same evening, a black carriage stopped beside her, and inside, a man whose life was bound to hers by pain, loss, and a love neither of them could yet name. Tonight you'll witness a story where pride meets compassion, and two broken souls dare to challenge destiny itself. Tell me, from where are you listening to this story? And do you believe that love can truly save a life? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1887. The ocean breeze carried with it the scent of salt and scandal, whispering against the grand facades of the summer estates that lined Bellevue Avenue. Behind one of those gleaming marble gates, in a household where gossip was sharper than any blade, the quiet life of Angelina Hartwell came to its ruin. The accusation had fallen upon her like a thunderclap. The missing brooch, an emerald heirloom of her employer's spoiled daughter, was suddenly declared stolen, and all eyes turned toward the maid with the calm voice and humble grace. Angelina stood before them, trembling yet dignified, her hands clasped before her as though in prayer. She denied the theft with a firmness that surprised even herself, but her words met only sneers. The mistress of the house, eager to protect her daughter's vanity, declared her guilt without proof, and within moments the butler was ordered to show her the door. The humiliation was swift and cruel. The servants who once shared laughter with her now looked away. Her meager belongings, 2 dresses, a Bible, and a small brooch of her own, made of brass rather than gold, were handed to her in a bundle of linen. By noon, Angelina Hartwell stood outside the iron gates of the mansion, dismissed without reference, without mercy, without hope. She walked along the narrow coastal road, her shoes worn thin, her heart heavier than the sea mist that clung to her hair. The cliffs of Newport glistened under the fading sun, the waves below roaring like some great wounded beast. Each step echoed her despair. In a society ruled by status, a dismissed servant was as good as invisible. No respectable household would hire a woman accused of theft. She would be condemned to the shadows, her name whispered with pity or disdain. Yet even in her sorrow, there was grace in her bearing. Her hazel eyes shimmered with restrained tears, not weakness. Her posture remained upright, as though clinging to the last threads of her dignity. A gust of wind lifted the hem of her plain grey dress, and with it came the faint scent of lavender soap, an honest fragrance, too simple for the deceitful world that had cast her out. The road grew lonelier as twilight deepened. The sky turned the color of burnished copper, and the first stars began to tremble above the ocean. Angelina slowed her steps, exhaustion threatening to overtake her. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the ache that pulsed beneath her ribs. She had given years of quiet service to people who never once looked at her as human, and now she was paying the price of their cruelty. From behind came the sound of wheels upon gravel, slow and deliberate. A carriage approached, its lamps glowing faintly against the encroaching dusk. Angelina stepped aside, lowering her eyes as it neared. But the vehicle halted beside her, and the door opened with a soft click. Inside, seated in elegant shadow, was a man whose presence seemed to command the air around him. His hair was dark, touched with early silver at the temples. His eyes, a deep shade between grey and blue, regarded her with quiet intensity. He wore a black coat with a velvet collar and gloves that gleamed faintly beneath the lamplight. "You seem lost," he said, his voice calm and even, though carrying a trace of authority. Angelina hesitated. "I am not lost, sir," she replied softly, "only without direction." Something flickered in his expression. Perhaps recognition, perhaps pity. "These roads are unsafe for a woman alone at this hour. Allow me to take you where you need to go." Her instinct was to refuse. She had been taught never to trust a stranger, especially one whose wealth placed him far above her station. But there was something in his tone, measured, deliberate, almost weary, that felt unlike the arrogance of the men she had known in her years of service. She looked at the carriage, polished and discreet, the kind belonging to someone who carried power without flaunting it. "I could not impose, sir," she murmured, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her bundle. "You would not," he said simply. "I insist." For a moment, silence fell between them, broken only by the sigh of the ocean. Then, with hesitant grace, Angelina climbed the small iron step and entered the carriage. The door closed behind her with a muted thud, sealing her fate with it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of tobacco and cedarwood. She sat on the edge of the seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The stranger observed her quietly, his face illuminated by the lantern outside the window. "My name is Julian Fairfax," he said after a long pause. "I am visiting Newport on business." She inclined her head. "Angelina Hartwell, sir." He studied her as though weighing unspoken words. "Miss Hartwell," he said at last, "I believe I may have heard your name before. You were in service to the Burtons, were you not?" The mention of that household sent a tremor through her. "I was," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze turning thoughtful. "I knew Mr. Burton before he passed. A respectable man. I'm sorry for what has happened to you." Angelina blinked in surprise. No one had offered her sympathy, not once. "You know what they say of me, then," she murmured. "I know what they say," Julian replied, "but I also know what kind of people they are." His tone softened. "The world has a cruel habit of punishing the honest." The carriage continued along the winding road, the rhythm of the wheels soothing in its constancy. Neither spoke for several moments, yet the silence between them was not empty. It was charged, alive, as though each sensed that fate had arranged their meeting for reasons still veiled. When the carriage finally reached the town square, Julian leaned forward, his voice low. "You have somewhere to stay." "A boarding house near Spring Street," she said. He nodded once, signaling the driver to stop. "Then I will leave you there safely." As the carriage halted, Angelina gathered her bundle, but before she could step down, Julian spoke again. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice touched with something solemn, "do not let tonight convince you that you are without worth. Sometimes ruin is only the beginning of what was meant for us." She met his gaze, steady, unwavering, and for a moment the world outside seemed to disappear. The distant waves, the cries of the gulls, the glow of the gaslights, all faded into silence. Only the echo of his words remained, lingering like the promise of something unknown. She descended into the misty evening, her heart unsteady, her future uncertain. The carriage rolled away, vanishing into the fog, leaving behind only the faint scent of cedar and destiny. The first light of dawn found Newport shrouded in a soft grey mist, the kind that veiled the sharp edges of the world and made everything appear distant, uncertain, as if life itself hesitated to begin anew. Inside a narrow boarding house on Spring Street, Angelina Hartwell sat by the window of a small rented room, watching the fog drift past the glass like a slow, mournful ghost. Her bundle lay on the wooden chair beside the bed. 2 worn dresses, a shawl of faded wool, and a small envelope containing the last of her savings. She had not slept. The events of the previous day had replayed endlessly in her mind. The cruel accusation, the humiliated silence, and the unexpected encounter with the man in the carriage, Julian Fairfax. His calm, steady voice still echoed in her thoughts, though she told herself that men of his world spoke kindly only out of pity. The room smelled faintly of soap and coal dust. The thin curtains swayed in the morning breeze, and the street below was beginning to stir with the sound of vendors and distant carriage wheels. Angelina clasped her hands in her lap, her fingers cold and pale. She had planned to leave Newport that very morning, to seek work in Providence or perhaps Boston, anywhere her name was not tarnished. But even that plan felt fragile, as if one harsh wind could scatter it to dust. She rose slowly, straightened the narrow bed, and folded her belongings with care. When she lifted the small mirror that hung by the window, her reflection startled her. The sleepless night had left a faint shadow beneath her eyes, and the gentle curve of her mouth bore the trace of sorrow. Yet her expression held something else, an unyielding quiet, a determination that life's cruelty would not make her cruel in return. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and descended the staircase to the small parlour, where Mrs. Callahan, the landlady, was arranging breakfast for her lodgers. The woman looked up with mild curiosity, her gaze softening when she saw Angelina's travel bundle. "Leaving us so soon, Miss Hartwell?" she asked, her voice kind but practical. Angelina nodded. "There is little reason to stay, ma'am." Mrs. Callahan sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're a good girl. The world has a strange way of turning against those who deserve it least. If you find work, write to me. I'll vouch for your character." Angelina smiled faintly, touched by the offer. "You are very kind. I shall not forget your generosity." She ate little, just a piece of bread and a cup of weak tea. When she stepped outside, the air was damp and cold, the sky a pale wash of silver. She tightened her shawl and turned toward the station. Her steps echoed on the cobblestones, steady but uncertain. Every sound of the city, the call of the paperboy, the clip of horses' hooves, the laughter of young women carrying baskets, seemed to remind her of what she had lost: belonging, dignity, peace. She had almost reached the corner when she noticed a carriage stopped near the post office. It was the same one she had entered the night before. Her breath caught, and before she could turn away, the door opened and Julian Fairfax stepped out. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, the morning light glinting faintly on the silver chain of his pocket watch. His presence carried a quiet command, the kind that did not need to raise its voice. People on the street instinctively moved aside as he approached, though his manner was neither arrogant nor hurried. "Miss Hartwell," he said, inclining his head with a touch of formality. Angelina froze, startled and uncertain. "Mr. Fairfax," she murmured, her tone polite but guarded. "You should not have troubled yourself." "I rarely trouble myself for what I do not intend," he replied gently. "May I have a word with you?" She hesitated, glancing around. The morning crowd paid them no mind, but propriety was a fragile thing for a woman alone. Still, something in his eyes, an earnestness she had not expected, compelled her to nod. He gestured toward a small cafe nearby, its windows fogged by the warmth within. They entered, and he requested a private table by the window. The waiter, recognizing wealth when he saw it, bowed and departed quickly. Angelina sat across from him, the steam of her untouched tea curling between them. She studied the man who now sat before her in the clear light of morning. His face was composed, but his eyes carried a shadow, a depth of sorrow she could not name. "I was not certain I would find you," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "But I am glad I did. I thought about our conversation last night." She folded her hands in her lap. "I am grateful for your kindness, sir, but I assure you I shall manage." He leaned slightly forward, his expression intent. "Forgive me, Miss Hartwell, but I do not believe that. Not because I doubt your courage, but because I understand the cruelty of this city better than most. You were dismissed unjustly. Your reputation is wounded. No respectable family will take you into service again, at least not in Newport. The world has left you little choice." His words struck too close to truth. Angelina felt her throat tighten. "That may be," she whispered, "but charity is not a kindness I can accept." Julian's lips curved faintly, not in amusement, but in admiration. "This is not charity. It is a proposition." She looked up, startled. "A proposition?" He hesitated, then spoke with measured care. "I have a daughter, Clara. She is 7 years old. Since her mother's death she has spoken scarcely a word. The nurses cannot reach her, nor the tutors. She is a child lost in silence. I need someone with gentleness, patience, and heart, qualities I believe you possess. I wish for you to come to New York as her companion." Angelina stared at him, uncomprehending. "You would offer me a position in your household?" "Yes, in my home on Fifth Avenue." The name alone conjured an image of marble staircases, chandeliers, and the quiet cruelty of the wealthy. She lowered her gaze. "That is not a world where I belong, Mr. Fairfax." "Perhaps not," he said softly, "but it may be the world that needs you." For a moment the cafe seemed to fade, and all she could hear was the faint ticking of the clock above the counter. His words carried both reason and mystery. To accept meant stepping into a life far removed from her own, one that could expose her to scrutiny and danger. Yet what awaited her otherwise? A slow descent into poverty and anonymity. Still, pride held her tongue. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Surely there are many in your circle more suitable." Julian's gaze darkened, though not with anger. "My circle," he said with quiet disdain, "is filled with pretense. I have no need for another woman who hides her cruelty behind politeness. I saw something in you last night, dignity in the face of injustice. I trust that more than I trust any recommendation." His words left her breathless. She wished to protest, but gratitude and disbelief tangled within her. "You know nothing of me." "Then allow me to learn," he replied. "You would have a private room, a fair wage, and no obligations beyond the care of my daughter. You may leave whenever you wish." Angelina studied him in silence. The temptation of security warred against her instinct for caution. His expression revealed no deceit, only a quiet sincerity that unsettled her heart. "Your daughter," she asked after a pause, "does she know of your offer?" A faint shadow crossed his features. "Not yet. But I believe she will understand, in time." They sat in silence for several moments, two lives suspended between chance and choice. Then Angelina drew a slow breath. "Very well," she said softly. "I accept." Julian's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, yet enough for her to glimpse the man beneath his composure. "Then it is settled," he said. "We shall depart for New York tomorrow." When he rose to pay the bill, Angelina's pulse quickened with something she could not name. Gratitude, fear, perhaps even the tremor of destiny. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The fog had lifted, revealing the sea in all its shimmering indifference. Angelina stood at the station platform, her small valise in hand. The whistle of the departing train echoed like a cry between worlds. Julian was already aboard, speaking briefly with the conductor. When he turned toward her, their eyes met across the distance. There was no smile, only a silent acknowledgement, a fragile trust forming in the space between them. As the train began to move, Angelina climbed the steps and entered the carriage. Through the window, Newport receded, its mansions, its cliffs, its false grandeur shrinking into memory. She settled into her seat, the rhythm of the wheels thrumming beneath her. The countryside unfurled outside, fields, rivers, and towns passing like pages of a forgotten book. Julian sat across from her, reading a newspaper, yet every so often his gaze lifted, and their eyes met without a word. In that quiet exchange, a strange understanding was born, unspoken, delicate, and undeniably real. Angelina turned her face toward the window once more. The horizon shimmered with the promise of a city she had never seen and a life she could not yet imagine. Behind her lay the ruins of the past. Ahead waited the uncertain mercy of a stranger's offer. New York City, winter of 1887. The sky above Fifth Avenue was a pale expanse of pearl gray, the kind of cold light that made even the wealthiest homes look like monuments carved from ice. The streets below pulsed with the rhythm of carriage wheels and hurried footsteps, but behind the tall iron gates of Julian Fairfax's mansion, the world seemed to stand still. When Angelina Hartwell stepped down from the carriage, her gloved hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the weight of what awaited her. The grand facade before her rose like a cathedral to another kind of faith, not in God, but in wealth. Columns of white marble framed tall arched windows, and the steps leading to the entrance glistened faintly with frost. The brass door knocker gleamed, polished to perfection, reflecting her uncertain face. Julian stood beside her, his coat buttoned neatly, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to your new home, Miss Hartwell," he said quietly. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is extraordinary." "Extraordinary," he repeated, his tone distant, but not alive. As if in answer, the heavy front doors opened, and a wave of cold, perfumed air escaped from within. A woman appeared, tall, stout and severe, her grey hair gathered into a strict bun. Her dark dress and stiff white collar spoke of discipline and rank. "Mrs. Hammond," Julian said, stepping forward, "this is Miss Hartwell, the lady who will assist with my daughter's care." Mrs. Hammond's sharp eyes swept over Angelina from head to toe, assessing her as one might a new piece of furniture, serviceable but untested. She gave a curt nod. "Yes, sir," she said. Then to Angelina, "Follow me. His lordship has instructed that you be shown to your quarters." Julian's gaze lingered on Angelina for a moment longer, his expression softer now, though tinged with something like regret. "You'll find Clara in the upstairs nursery after you've settled. She's shy." Angelina inclined her head. "I will be gentle." He gave a faint nod before turning away, his footsteps echoing across the marble vestibule. Inside, the house was a world of its own, vast, immaculate, and painfully silent. Light spilled from chandeliers of cut crystal, scattering pale reflections across walls lined with paintings of ancestral faces. Every object, every vase, every candlestick spoke of order and control. Yet beneath that beauty, Angelina sensed something hollow, as though joy itself had been banished from the rooms long ago. Mrs. Hammond led her down a corridor covered with a Persian runner that softened their steps. "You will rise at 6, she said briskly. "Breakfast is at 8. Miss Clara studies from 9 to 11, takes her meal at 1, and rests until 3. You are to remain with her during her lessons, walks, and bedtime. The child can be difficult. You will learn patience." "I understand," Angelina replied. The housekeeper gave her a sidelong glance. "You understand little, Miss Hartwell, but you will." They climbed a staircase so wide it could have fit a carriage. At the landing, tall stained glass windows filtered the weak daylight into somber colors. Ruby, amber, and emerald shadows spilled across the steps. When they reached the 3rd floor, Mrs. Hammond opened a door to a modest but elegant room. "This will be yours. Keep it tidy. Mr. Fairfax values order." Angelina looked around. The chamber was small but bright, with white walls, a narrow iron bed, and a washstand beside the window. From there she could see the avenue below. Carriages passing, snowflakes drifting through the air like slow-burning embers. For the first time since her dismissal in Newport, she felt a fragile sense of safety. "Thank you," she said softly. Mrs. Hammond's tone was clipped. "Don't thank me, Miss Hartwell. Gratitude is a burden. Do your duty, and we shall get along." She left, closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Angelina placed her small valise on the bed and opened it carefully. Her belongings looked pitiful in such surroundings. 2 dresses, a brush, and a folded handkerchief embroidered with her mother's initials. She arranged them neatly in the small wardrobe, then sat by the window, gazing out into the fading afternoon. When the bell chimed 6 times from the distant hallway clock, she rose and adjusted her collar, smoothing the fabric nervously. It was time to meet Clara Fairfax. The nursery was at the far end of the corridor, its door half open. A faint melody drifted out, a music box, tinkling with the fragile tune of a forgotten lullaby. Angelina knocked gently, then stepped inside. The room was large and filled with light, though the atmosphere was heavy with melancholy. Toys sat untouched on the shelves. A dollhouse stood by the window, its miniature curtains drawn as if mirroring the house itself. In the corner, by a low table, sat a little girl in a white dress, her golden curls gleaming beneath the pale winter sun. "Miss Clara," Angelina said softly. The child did not turn. Her hands rested still on her lap, her gaze fixed on the music box as it played its final notes. Angelina approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "My name is Miss Hartwell. Your father has asked me to spend some time with you." Still no answer. The girl's shoulders rose and fell with quiet, controlled breaths. There was no trace of hostility, only the stillness of one who had retreated deep inside herself. Angelina crouched beside her. "That is a beautiful tune," she said, her voice low and gentle. "I used to listen to one just like it when I was your age. My mother said it kept the bad dreams away." Clara's eyes flickered, the faintest movement of life. For a moment, Angelina thought she might speak, but instead the child reached out and closed the lid of the music box. Silence returned, vast and fragile. A figure appeared in the doorway, Mrs. Hammond. "Miss Clara does not speak," she said sharply. "You may talk to her, but you'll find it a one-sided conversation." Angelina rose, smoothing her skirts. "Children sometimes need time." "Time is not the issue," Mrs. Hammond replied. "Loss is." Her tone softened just slightly. "The master will dine at 8. You are to remain upstairs. He takes his meals alone." After she left, Angelina sat quietly beside Clara once more. The child had turned toward the window, where the snow was beginning to fall again. Each flake drifted down in silence, dissolving against the cold glass. Angelina reached out, resting her hand on the edge of the table, close enough for Clara to notice, but not close enough to frighten her. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she whispered. "It looks like the sky is sending little pieces of light to remind us we're not alone." For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of curiosity in the girl's reflection. That evening, after Clara was settled into bed, Angelina wandered through the upper hall in near darkness. A single gas lamp flickered against the wall, throwing soft gold against the portraits that lined the corridor. She paused before one, a woman with fair hair and gentle eyes, painted in delicate strokes of ivory and rose. There was tenderness in the expression and an air of melancholy that lingered even in oil and canvas. Angelina realized she was looking at the late Mrs. Fairfax. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned and saw Julian standing a few paces away, his hands clasped behind his back. The dim light softened his features, yet the weariness in his eyes was unmistakable. "You found her portrait," he said quietly. "She has a kind face," Angelina replied. She did. His gaze lingered on the painting for a long moment. "Clara looks very much like her." Angelina nodded, unsure what to say. "Your daughter is a gentle child. Lonely perhaps, but not unreachable." He looked at her then, a faint spark of surprise in his expression. "You believe she can recover?" "I believe kindness is a language even silence understands," she said softly. The corner of his mouth lifted, though not quite into a smile. "You speak with conviction, Miss Hartwell. That is rare in this house." She hesitated, sensing the weight behind his words. "Perhaps your home has been quiet for too long." His eyes darkened. "Quiet," he murmured, "and full of ghosts." Before she could reply, he inclined his head politely. "Good night, Miss Hartwell." "Good night, Mr. Fairfax." She watched him walk away, his figure vanishing into the shadows at the end of the hall. When the silence returned, it seemed heavier than before, but somehow less hopeless. Angelina returned to her room, the image of the little girl's solemn eyes and the widower's guarded sorrow lingering in her thoughts. She sat by the window once more, gazing down at the glittering avenue where the carriages still passed beneath the gaslights. The city outside was alive, but within the marble walls of the Fairfax mansion, time seemed suspended, as if grief itself had cast a spell. And yet, in that house of shadows, something faint but certain began to stir, the first fragile pulse of warmth in a place that had long forgotten the sound of a living heart. Winter deepened over New York, wrapping the city in a veil of frost and restless rumor. From the tall windows of the Fairfax mansion, the streets of Fifth Avenue glittered beneath a pale moon, their carriages tracing slow lines of gold through the snow. Inside, warmth lingered only in certain corners, by the hearth in the nursery, where Angelina Hartwell sat, reading softly to Clara, her voice weaving tales into the silence like threads of light into shadow. It had been several weeks since her arrival. Slowly the house had begun to breathe again. Where once there had been only stillness, now the sound of gentle laughter echoed faintly through the upper halls. Clara's laughter, soft but real. The little girl no longer hid behind her dolls or retreated into wordless solitude. Each evening, as Angelina sat beside her bed with a lamp glowing between them, she would listen with wide eyes to stories of faraway kingdoms, of sailors who followed the stars, of children who found courage in their dreams. Tonight, the firelight shimmered across Clara's golden curls as she clutched a small velvet rabbit to her chest. "Tell me the part about the bird again," she whispered, her voice tremulous but eager. Angelina smiled gently. "The bird who carried the last piece of sunlight?" Clara nodded, eyes glistening. "Very well," Angelina said, lowering her voice to a soft, musical tone. "When the bird saw the world turning cold, she took a spark of the dying sun and hid it beneath her wing. She flew through nights of storm and snow, never resting, until she found a child whose heart had grown so lonely it could no longer remember what warmth felt like. And when the bird laid the light upon that child's chest, the world began to bloom again." Clara's lips parted in wonder. "Did the bird stay?" Angelina brushed a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. "No, my dear. The bird flew away so others might find her light, but the warmth she left behind never faded." The child sighed, her small fingers tightening around Angelina's hand. "It's a sad story. Sometimes the saddest stories are the ones that teach us the most," Angelina murmured, her gaze tender. "They remind us that love, even when it leaves, changes everything it touches." Clara's eyes began to close, lulled by the rhythm of her words. Within moments, she drifted into sleep. Angelina sat quietly beside her, the lamplight painting her face in tones of amber and gold. She looked upon the child with affection she had not expected to feel, a bond not born of duty, but of something deeper, maternal and pure. When she rose, she covered Clara with the embroidered blanket and turned down the wick of the lamp. The corridor outside was dim, the air cool and still. As she passed the portrait of the late Mrs. Fairfax, the woman's painted eyes seemed to follow her. There was grace in that face, yes, but also sorrow, as though she knew the weight of the love and loss that still haunted her husband. Downstairs, faint strains of piano music drifted through the mansion. The melody was slow, deliberate, played by someone whose hands remembered beauty, but whose heart no longer believed in it. Angelina descended quietly, drawn by the sound. The music room lay at the far end of the gallery, its door slightly ajar. Candlelight flickered across polished floors and the gleam of ivory keys. Julian Fairfax sat at the grand piano, his back straight, his expression veiled by thought. The light caught the silver in his hair, the strong line of his shoulders, the stillness of a man too long accustomed to silence. Angelina lingered at the threshold, unwilling to disturb him, yet unable to leave. The notes rose and fell, filled with restrained sorrow. A lament, perhaps, for something irretrievable. When the final chord faded, Julian's hands remained on the keys, unmoving. "You need not hide, Miss Hartwell," he said quietly, without turning. "The house has enough ghosts without adding you to their number." Angelina stepped forward, her cheeks flushed. "Forgive me, sir. I did not wish to intrude. The music was beautiful, beautiful," he echoed, his tone tinged with bitterness. It was her melody. Her eyes flicked toward the portrait above the mantel, the same woman, painted in another moment of grace, her hands resting lightly on a music score. "Your wife's?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the keys. "She composed it one winter when Clara was still a baby. I haven't played it since the day she—" He stopped himself, the word unfinished. "It seems grief never loses its patience." Angelina's heart ached at the quiet despair in his voice. Grief is not cruel, Mr. Fairfax. It is simply unwilling to be forgotten. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a faint exhale, he closed the piano lid. Perhaps you are right, but I envy those who can bury it beneath noise and society. I have neither the gift nor the desire for pretense. Angelina studied him, this man of discipline and sorrow, whose eyes seemed to have known both tenderness and betrayal. "Noise cannot silence the heart, sir," she said softly. "It only makes the silence more unbearable." Their eyes met, and in that instant, something wordless passed between them, a flicker of understanding, fleeting and dangerous. Julian straightened, breaking the gaze first. "Good night, Miss Hartwell." "Good night, Mr. Fairfax," she replied, her voice barely audible. As she turned to leave, the faint reflection of them both shimmered on the piano's polished surface. Two lonely souls, caught between memory and mercy. The following morning, the household buzzed with subdued tension. The servants whispered in corners, glancing at Angelina with curiosity that bordered on suspicion. The butler, Mr. Alden, greeted her politely but avoided her gaze. Even Mrs. Hammond, usually stern and unflappable, seemed unsettled. At breakfast, Angelina noticed a folded newspaper lying beside the silver coffee pot. A section had been marked in a pencil. While pouring Clara's milk, she caught sight of the headline, "The Reclusive Tycoon and His Mysterious Companion." Her hand froze. "Mrs. Hammond cleared her throat. "It appears the city has taken an interest in our household," she said dryly. "Society thrives on gossip, Miss Hartwell. You must learn to ignore it." Angelina forced a calm smile. "I have no wish to be spoken of at all." "That would make you the first woman in New York to succeed in it," the housekeeper replied, with a hint of wry amusement. "But mind yourself. Idle talk has ruined reputations far stronger than yours." Angelina nodded, though her heart thudded painfully. She had done nothing improper, yet the thought of being discussed in salons and drawing rooms filled her with dread. The idea that anyone might suspect impropriety between her and Julian felt like an intrusion into something sacred, unspoken, and fragile. Later that day, while walking with Clara in the courtyard, she caught sight of two ladies passing by the front gates in a carriage. They leaned close together, their parasols tilted just enough to conceal their smiles. One of them whispered something, and both laughed lightly before the carriage rolled on. Clara looked up. "Why are they laughing?" Angelina forced a gentle tone. "Because they have nothing better to do, my dear." That evening, long after the household had quieted, Angelina descended the staircase to return a book she had borrowed from the library. As she neared the study, the murmur of voices stopped her. The door was slightly open, and through the crack she saw Julian standing beside his desk, his posture rigid. Across from him stood a man in a dark coat, older, lean, his expression sharp. "I'm warning you, Fairfax," the man said in a low, cutting voice. "Silence has its price. The past will not stay buried forever." Julian's reply was calm, but his tone carried iron beneath it. "You mistake me for someone who fears threats. I have paid my debts to the living and the dead." The stranger gave a cold smile. "Then you should be prepared to pay again. There are those who would pay handsomely for the truth about your late wife's accident." Angelina's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her chest, frozen. Julian's eyes narrowed. "Leave my house, Mr. Whitcomb. And should you ever speak of my family again, you will regret it." The lawyer adjusted his gloves slowly, deliberately. "We shall see." He turned and strode toward the door. Angelina barely managed to retreat behind the corner as he passed, his footsteps echoing through the hall like a metronome of menace. When the door closed, Julian remained still, his hand braced against the mantel. The light from the fire carved deep shadows across his face, revealing a torment far greater than anger. Angelina lingered unseen, her pulse trembling. She did not understand the meaning of the exchange, but she felt its danger like a chill through the walls. Secrets hung in this house like portraits, beautiful, silent, and impossible to ignore. As she climbed back to her room, the echo of the lawyer's words followed her. The past will not stay buried forever. She paused at the top of the stairs, glancing down the dim corridor that led to the music room. Somewhere in the distance, a piano key struck once, soft, accidental, like a heartbeat breaking the silence. And in that single sound, Angelina understood that whatever sorrow Julian Fairfax carried, it was not the kind that time could heal. It was the kind that waited, restless and wounded, in the shadows of marble walls. The chandeliers of the Waldorf Grand Ballroom glittered like constellations captured beneath a gilded ceiling. Light shimmered across satin gowns and lacquered shoes, mingling with the laughter and rustle of silks as New York's elite swept across the marble floors. In that world of champagne and pretense, appearances were everything, and whispers sharper than diamonds. Angelina Hartwell stood at the edge of that world, heart trembling beneath the modest bodice of her dress. She had never imagined herself in such a place, not as a maid nor as a guest, and certainly not at the side of Julian Fairfax. Yet there she was, standing behind him and little Clara, both of whom had just stepped down from the black Fairfax carriage. The Tycoon wore a dark tailcoat that made his tall frame appear even more commanding, his white gloves and starched cravat impeccable. Clara, nestled between them, clung to his hand with shy determination, her golden curls adorned with a simple velvet ribbon. Angelina had hesitated to come, but Julian had insisted with quiet resolve. "She needs you close tonight," he'd said that morning. "I won't subject her to this world alone." She had nodded, though the thought of walking into a ballroom filled with polished cruelty made her stomach tighten. Her dress had been chosen by Mrs. Hammond herself, pale blue silk, modest in cut, without the lavish embroidery of society ladies. Its elegance was in its simplicity. A cameo brooch at her throat, borrowed from the housekeeper's personal chest, was the only ornament. Her hair had been arranged in a low chignon, soft tendrils framing her face. She looked like someone who did not belong there, and yet whose presence could not be denied. From the moment they stepped into the ballroom, silence rippled. Fans paused mid-wave, champagne glasses stilled, heads turned, first toward Julian, always a figure of fascination, and then toward the woman walking 3 steps behind him. "She's the governess, they say," someone whispered. "No governess dresses like that. I heard she was dismissed from her last post under scandal. She walks as if she owns the marble." Angelina kept her gaze low, her hands folded gently at her waist. She felt their stares like pins on her skin, but she did not flinch. Clara, sensing the unease, pressed closer to her, and Angelina offered her a reassuring smile. Julian's expression remained unreadable. His presence alone silenced most murmurs, but not all. In the far corner of the ballroom stood a cluster of women in jewel-toned gowns, their feathers and pearls swaying with every measured movement. Among them was Miss Lydia Ashcombe, heiress to a railroad fortune, known not only for her beauty, but for her pride and unyielding pursuit of Julian Fairfax. Lydia approached with a practiced smile and a calculating glint in her eyes. "Mr. Fairfax," she greeted, curtsying slightly. "What a rare pleasure. And Miss Clara, how you've grown." Julian inclined his head. "Miss Ashcombe." Then Lydia turned her gaze on Angelina, her lips curving with the cruelty of someone who delights in drawing blood behind a velvet glove. "And who might this be? A new addition to your collection?" Before Angelina could speak, Julian's voice cut through the air, cool, precise, unmistakable. "This is Miss Hartwell, companion to my daughter. She is under my protection and therefore beyond your insult." Gasps bloomed like wildflowers around them. The insult was clear, but the defense, public, direct and absolute, was louder. Lydia's painted smile faltered, her cheeks flushed with fury barely masked by poise. "I see," she said, her voice low. "Then you've made your position quite clear." "I have," Julian said. Come, Clara." He turned and walked away, Clara and Angelina beside him, leaving Lydia frozen like a statue of spite beneath a crystal chandelier. The whispers swelled as they passed. Some pitied, some judged, but many watched with something akin to awe. Never before had the Tycoon so openly defied society's expectations, not for a woman of wealth, but for a woman of no name at all. They remained only for the hour required by obligation. Julian shook hands, nodded, made brief conversation with board members and donors, but always he kept Clara close and his gaze flickering toward Angelina, as if ensuring she remained within reach. When at last they returned to the mansion, the winter wind biting at their coats, Clara said not a word during the ride. Her eyes were heavy with something more than sleep, a weight of emotions stirred by silk and shadows. Julian helped her down from the carriage, and Angelina followed quietly into the entry hall, lit with soft amber lamps. Mrs. Hammond greeted them, her expression unreadable. She offered no comment about the evening, only a silent glance toward Clara, as if asking without words whether the child had endured. "I will take her to her room," Angelina said gently. Julian nodded. "Thank you." Inside the nursery, Clara sat quietly on the edge of her bed, her small fingers pulling at the hem of her dress. Angelina knelt before her, removing the child's shoes with slow, careful hands. "You were very brave tonight," she whispered. "I was proud of you." Clara looked at her, eyes round and glistening. "They stared at you." Angelina paused, then smiled faintly. "Yes, but I didn't mind, because I had your hand in mine." Clara's lip trembled. She leaned forward suddenly, wrapping her arms around Angelina's neck. The hug was tight, fierce, unexpected, and then, barely audible, a single word broke the silence. "Mama." Angelina froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt the child's heartbeat against her chest, small and rapid. Slowly she pulled back, her hands on Clara's shoulders. "What did you say?" Clara blinked up at her, eyes wide and wet. "Mama," she repeated softer this time, as if afraid the word might break. Tears welled in Angelina's eyes. She gathered the child in her arms, pressing a kiss to her temple. "My sweet girl," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm here. I'm here." Outside, snow began to fall once more, blanketing the city in silent white. But inside the nursery, warmth bloomed, not from the hearth, but from the fragile miracle of a child's voice calling love back into the world. And somewhere, in the music room below, a man stood staring at a portrait and wondering if hearts once shattered could ever beat again. The wind that swept along Fifth Avenue that night was quiet, but insistent, a wind that whispered of secrets long buried and emotions too dangerous to name. The Fairfax mansion, illuminated by the soft flicker of gas lamps, stood like a monument to a family that once knew joy and now clung to silence like a sacred veil. Angelina stood alone on the upper terrace, wrapped in a dark wool shawl, her hands clasped before her as she gazed at the city beyond. The rooftops shimmered under a dusting of snow, and the street lamps below glowed like fireflies in the mist. From where she stood, she could hear the muffled sound of the clock striking 10 from a distant bell tower, marking the hour with melancholy solemnity. She had stepped outside for air, but in truth, it was not the cold she wished to escape. It was the warmth growing in her chest, too fierce, too forbidden, too alive. Clara had fallen asleep early that evening, curling beside her with the soft contentment of a child who had, at last, found comfort. Julian had been absent during supper, and the weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the corridors. She did not hear his approach until his voice broke the quiet. "You favor the cold," Julian said gently, his deep voice blending with the hush of the wind. "I've noticed you always seek the night air." Angelina turned slowly. He stood near the door, a long black overcoat draped over his shoulders, the collar turned up slightly. His dark hair, brushed back with habitual care, caught the soft glow of the gaslight above them. There was something different in his expression, less guarded, more uncertain. "I find the cold honest," she replied softly. "It never pretends to be what it is not." Julian stepped closer, his boots barely echoing on the stone. "And do you find this house dishonest, Miss Hartwell?" She hesitated, her eyes never leaving his. "No, only wounded." His gaze deepened. Like its owner. She drew in a breath, startled by his candor. "I did not mean—" "I know what you meant," he said almost tenderly. "You speak with more truth than most who have passed through these walls." They stood in silence then, facing one another beneath the pale light of the gas flame, its halo flickering gently above them. The city loomed in the distance, but in that moment, they were alone in a world where time held its breath. Julian's hands slipped into the pockets of his coat, his voice quiet, steady. "You should know something, Miss Hartwell, about my wife." Angelina's breath caught. She nodded slowly. He turned toward the railing, leaning against it with the weariness of someone who had carried a burden too long. "They say she died in her sleep, peacefully, a woman taken too soon." "And that is not the truth?" she asked gently. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, the truth is far less poetic. She overdosed on a medication she had no prescription for. I was away on business when it happened. When I returned, they had already shaped the story. A soft ending, an untainted legacy." Angelina stepped closer, her voice no louder than the wind. "And you let them believe it?" He turned his head to look at her. "I had no choice. Her family, wealthy, powerful, obsessed with appearances, they made it clear. Either I allowed them to rewrite her end, or they would drag Clara into the scandal. Question my fitness as a father, threaten guardianship. I couldn't risk it." Angelina's heart twisted. "You protected your daughter. You did what any man with a soul would have done." Julian's eyes searched hers, the flickering light catching the sorrow etched in the lines at the corners. "But it has followed me, the whispers, the guilt, the silence. I buried the truth, but I buried myself with it." He turned fully now, facing her, his voice trembling ever so slightly. "Then you arrived." And suddenly Clara laughed again. The house began to breathe again. "And I—" Angelina swallowed, her voice unsteady. "And you—" He took a step closer. Their shadows stretched long across the stone, meeting before their bodies did. I remembered what it was to feel, to want. The air between them crackled, not with noise but with emotion, thick, trembling, dangerous. She looked up at him, and for a moment all the rules of class and propriety faded into the distance. "I don't know if I deserve this," he whispered, "but I haven't wanted anything so badly in years." Angelina's breath hitched, her eyes shining. "Then don't speak. Just—" He didn't wait for the rest. Slowly, reverently, he raised one hand to her cheek, his gloved fingers brushing the edge of her jaw. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Her eyes fluttered closed as he leaned in, not boldly, not greedily, but with the hesitance of a man afraid to break something fragile. Their lips met beneath the flicker of the gaslight, a kiss so soft, it was almost a question, a murmur, a prayer. There was no urgency, no hunger, only longing, trembling, a moment stolen from a world that would never understand. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. For several seconds, neither of them moved. "I've ruined everything now," he murmured. "No," she whispered. "You reminded me that I'm still a woman." They remained that way, breath to breath, until a sound interrupted the night. The faint creak of a shutter, the whisper of fabric brushing against stone. Mrs. Hammond. From a shadowed corner of the second-floor balcony, she had seen everything. Her lips pressed into a line, her eyes narrowed. The housekeeper turned with silent precision and disappeared down the hall, her steps swift and purposeful. Inside the study, she opened the secretary's drawer and retrieved a sheet of paper, pressing the nib of her pen to its surface. Her handwriting was precise, unwavering. "To Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, regarding your late daughter's child." Her hand did not tremble. The ink dried before the wax seal was pressed. By morning, a courier would be on his way, and with him, a truth reawakened. But outside on the terrace, the man and the woman stood beneath the gaslight, unaware of the chain they had set in motion. They stood wrapped in silence and moonlight, their hearts suspended in the space between what had been and what might still become. Neither spoke again. There were no more words left that night, only the echo of a kiss that tasted of sorrow and hope, and the quiet dread of dawn approaching far too soon. The drawing-room had never known such silence, not even during the mourning days that followed the funeral of Eleanor Fairfax. But on that afternoon, the stillness in the air was not born of grief. It was something colder, heavier. It was betrayal, freshly sharpened, wrapped in formality, and sealed in a white envelope bearing the crest of the Whitcomb family. Julian stood by the tall window, his back to the room, the letter in his hand trembling ever so slightly. The snow beyond the glass fell softly, mocking the storm that raged within him. On the opposite side of the room, seated on the tufted settee with a handkerchief crushed in her lap, sat Angelina. Her hands were folded, her spine erect, but her expression betrayed the ache she could no longer conceal. Her heart beat in dread as she waited for his voice. He had read the letter twice already, once with disbelief, a second time with a fury so controlled it turned his breath shallow. Finally he turned. "They claim impropriety," he said, his voice low, clipped, "that your presence in this house endangers Clara's well-being." Angelina felt the words like a slow knife. "Impropriety," she repeated, stunned. Julian nodded, bitterness tightening his jaw. "According to them, a former servant, particularly one dismissed under suspicion, has no place in the home of a respectable child. They cite the guardianship clause, the one I foolishly agreed to years ago, when I believed they only wanted to protect her." She stood, her chest rising with quiet defiance. "They mean to use me to take Clara." "They already have," he replied, each word weighted with helplessness. "This morning, while you were in the nursery, Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb arrived with a court order. Clara was escorted from the house without my knowledge. They claimed it was temporary, pending review, but we both know what this is." Angelina felt her knees weaken. "She's gone?" His voice dropped. "I tried to stop them, but they had the law on their side, and I was caught unprepared." The room spun for a moment, and she gripped the edge of the settee for balance. She must have been frightened. "She wept," he said bitterly. "Called for you." Angelina's lips parted, but no sound came. Only her eyes, wide with anguish, revealed the wound that had opened inside her. Julian stepped closer, his voice softening. "They will not keep her long. I will challenge this. I'll fight until she is home again. But until then—" She looked up at him, her voice barely audible. "What will they do to you if I stay?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. "I see," she whispered. His eyes found hers. "They demand your removal. They believe your presence is corrupting. They will use it as leverage against me in court. If I defy them, Clara becomes the casualty." Angelina turned her face away, fighting the storm behind her ribs. "Then I must go." "No." The word escaped him before he could stop it. Her gaze met his again, full of all the longing she had fought to keep buried. "There is no other way, Julian. You know it." He moved as if to reach for her, but something in her posture, dignified, immovable, stopped him. "I will not be the reason you lose your daughter," she said softly, "even if my heart must break for it." Mrs. Hammond entered quietly, holding a small envelope in her hands. Her eyes flicked between them before she addressed Julian with her usual briskness. "The carriage is ready. Miss Hartwell's belongings have been packed." Julian closed his eyes. "So soon?" Angelina gave a faint smile. "No one ever prepares for farewells." He looked at her then, not as the Tycoon of Fifth Avenue, not as the man society feared, but as a soul stripped bare. "You were the first light in this house in years, Angelina. They can take you from my home, but not from what you've changed in it." She fought the tears that blurred her vision. I shall carry Clara in my heart, and you too. The walk to the carriage was quiet. Servants lined the hall in uneasy silence. Even Mrs. Hammond, who had once eyed her with suspicion, now avoided her gaze. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently to the ground like the ashes of something once warm. Julian helped her into the carriage, but did not follow. He stood at the edge of the steps, his coat unbuttoned, the wind lifting the hem slightly. He said nothing. He simply watched, his eyes locked with hers until the door closed. As the horses pulled away, Angelina did not look back. She could not. Her hands, gloved and shaking, lay folded in her lap. The streets blurred past, but she saw none of them. Her thoughts were with a child sleeping in a strange bed, and a man who had once kissed her beneath a gas lamp, as if the world had finally stopped spinning. The boarding house on West 47th Street was a plain, narrow structure with creaking floors and faded wallpaper. The landlady, a widow with stiff hands and kind eyes, gave her a modest room and a cup of warm tea without asking too many questions. Angelina unpacked in silence, arranging the little she had: a comb, a Bible, a shawl, a photograph of Clara that Julian had given her on the ride to the train station. She placed it gently on the nightstand, then sat on the bed with her back straight, unwilling to surrender to the collapse that threatened to overtake her. 3 days passed. No letters came. No word from Julian. No sign of Clara. She wandered the streets during the day, searching for employment, and returned each evening to the same small room, where the clock ticked with cruel consistency. On the 4th morning, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, the landlady handed her a sealed envelope. There was no return address. Angelina opened it with careful fingers. Inside, she found a single sheet of fine paper and a note written in an unfamiliar hand. Miss Hartwell, what you seek lies in the truth they buried. The name you must remember is Whitcomb. Below the note was a folded legal document, yellowed, dated nearly 8 years prior. It was a copy of a letter of intent signed by Julian Fairfax and a lawyer by the name of Charles Whitcomb, granting temporary custody of Clara to the Whitcomb family in the event of emergency, but only if Julian were proven unfit or absent. Attached to it was a second page, unsigned, unfiled, accusing Julian of negligence in the death of his wife, citing emotional instability and improper companionship. It was never officially submitted. Angelina's fingers trembled. The accusation that had been used to take Clara had been prepared long ago, premeditated, a weapon waiting to be used. Her breath quickened. Her thoughts raced. Someone had planned this. Someone who had wanted Julian discredited, isolated, controllable. She read the final line again. The name you must remember is Whitcomb. Charles Whitcomb, the same man she had overheard weeks ago in the study, threatening Julian with knowledge of the past. Angelina folded the documents with care, her heart now beating with more than sorrow. For the first time in days, her grief gave way to fire. She rose from the bed, her movements swift and resolute. The world outside her window remained the same, grey, cold, indifferent. But inside her something had changed. She no longer felt helpless. She no longer felt afraid. She had been cast out, humiliated, and silenced. But now she held a truth that could undo everything her enemies had built. And she would not rest until the child she loved and the man who had trusted her heart were free from the chains forged by lies. The snow continued to fall, but beneath it, spring had already begun to stir. The days in the boarding house passed with the cruel stillness of winter, slow, heavy, and without promise. The soft ticking of the mantel clock became a quiet torment to Angelina Hartwell, each second marking the distance between herself and all that had once felt within reach. Clara was gone. Julian had not written. The walls of the modest room seemed to press in on her more each morning, her thoughts circling endlessly around the same questions. But the letter she had received days earlier, the unsigned message, the folded documents, burned in her thoughts like an ember refusing to die. She had read the name again and again, Whitcomb. Now she stood outside a building on Chambers Street, her gloved hands clenched at her sides. The brass plaque beside the door read, Whitcomb and Elridge, attorneys at law. From the street, the office appeared quiet, formal, unimposing. But Angelina knew the truth was rarely kept in grand halls. It hid in places like this. She stepped inside, her boots tapping firmly against the polished floor. The receptionist looked up, startled by the intensity in her eyes. "I need to speak with Mr. Whitcomb," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "Tell him it concerns the estate of Eleanor Fairfax." The name landed like a stone. Within minutes she was ushered into a panelled office where the air smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and dust. Charles Whitcomb, older now, thinner than she remembered, stood from behind his desk with a forced smile. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I must say I didn't expect to see you again. I heard you had moved on." She closed the door behind her. "You were counting on that, weren't you?" He raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I know what you did," she said, removing the folded documents from her coat pocket and placing them on his desk. "You forged a second document years ago, one that was never filed, accusing Julian Fairfax of negligence, implying he was responsible for his wife's death." Whitcomb's smile faded. "Where did you get this?" "That's not the question you should be asking." She leaned forward. "You should be asking how many people I've shown it to, how long it will take before it reaches the courts, because I assure you, Mr. Whitcomb, it will." He glanced down at the pages, his jaw tightening. "You have no idea the circles you're walking into, Miss Hartwell. There are names behind that paper that reach far beyond Julian Fairfax. The Whitcombs didn't act alone." "Then tell me who did," she said sharply. "Tell me everything, or I will take this to the newspapers." For a moment, the room hung in suspended silence. Then Whitcomb exhaled and sat slowly, as if the weight of years had suddenly settled on his shoulders. "It wasn't meant to go this far," he muttered. "Eleanor was troubled. Everyone knew it, but her family refused to let her memory be stained by scandal. When she died, they came to me. They had the money, the reach, the ambition. I was just the tool." "You accused Julian of a crime he never committed," she said, her voice trembling. "You ruined his name, and now you've stolen his daughter." Whitcomb didn't meet her eyes. "I warned him. I gave him a chance to walk away quietly. He didn't listen." Angelina's fury simmered beneath her calm. "You gave him a chance to surrender to a lie." He said nothing. She gathered the papers again, pressing them firmly back into her coat. "This ends now," she said. "You can either cooperate or you can watch your career burn." She turned and walked out before he could answer, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sounds of the city. That night she sat in the small kitchen of the boarding house, staring at the fire, when a knock came at the door. Mrs. Callahan entered, her expression curious. "There's a woman here to see you," she said. "Says she worked for the Fairfaxes once." Angelina rose, confused. A moment later, a thin, weathered woman stepped into the room. Her eyes, though tired, held the sharp clarity of memory. "My name is Nora," she said softly. "I was Mrs. Fairfax's lady's maid." "I heard you were looking for the truth." Angelina's breath caught. "Please sit, tell me everything." Nora did. She spoke of the late Mrs. Fairfax's declining mental state, the medications she had been taking in secret, and the increasing control her family tried to exert over Julian's decisions. She confirmed that on the night of Eleanor's death, a heated argument had occurred between Julian and Eleanor's brother, an argument over money, custody, and legacy. "She didn't want her family near the child," Nora said. "She told me that herself. She feared what they would turn Clara into." Angelina listened, absorbing every detail. When Nora handed her a small pouch filled with letters, Handwritten by Eleanor herself, Angelina felt the gravity of what she now held, the truth in the late woman's own hand. The next morning, she packed her few belongings and prepared to return to Julian. But before she could, a telegram arrived from Mrs. Hammond. Miss Clara ill, refuses food, calls for you in her sleep, come quickly. Angelina's hands trembled as she read the words. Without hesitation, she boarded the first carriage that would take her back to Fifth Avenue. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Fairfax mansion, Julian stood at the edge of the nursery, staring into the dim room where Clara lay in bed, pale and feverish. Her cheeks were flushed, her breathing shallow. "She won't eat," Mrs. Hammond whispered. "She speaks only one name." "Angelina," he said, barely audible. Guilt weighed on him like a stone. He had tried everything, doctors, warm milk, lullabies, but the child's soul had grown quiet again, as if the light that had begun to bloom in her had been taken away. He sat by her side, brushing a damp curl from her forehead. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I let them take you from the one person who never failed you." That night, as Clara turned restlessly in her sleep, the doors of the mansion opened once more to a figure cloaked in grey wool, her eyes fierce with purpose. Angelina had returned, and she was not alone. She carried the truth in her hands, and in her heart an unbreakable vow. This time she would not leave without a fight. The snowstorm had begun without warning, swift and merciless, sweeping down from the Hudson like a ghost in fury. Streets vanished beneath thick drifts, carriages halted mid-journey, and chimneys across the city bled smoke into a sky the color of lead. But nothing could stop her. Angelina Hartwell stood on the steps of the Fairfax mansion, her arms wrapped around the fragile, shivering body of Clara. Her cloak, soaked through with snow, clung to her back, her cheeks raw from the cold, her breath sharp and fast. But she had not faltered. Not on the train. Not on the streets. Not when the wind had nearly pushed her to her knees. The great double doors opened at last, and the warmth of the entrance hall spilled out like a golden promise. Mrs. Hammond appeared first, her face blanching at the sight before her. "Dear Lord, Miss Hartwell," she gasped, reaching instinctively toward Clara. "She's burning with fever," Angelina said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I've brought her home." Julian arrived moments later. His coat was half-buttoned, his expression one of stunned disbelief. "Clara," he breathed, rushing forward. Angelina gently transferred the child into his arms. "She was left in a cold room for hours," she said. "The servants said the Whitcombs had gone to a dinner party. She called for me in her sleep." Julian looked down at his daughter, her skin pale, her lips dry, her eyelids fluttering. He clutched her closer, his composure unraveling before the household. "Bring blankets," he barked. "Boil water, and call Dr. Aldridge immediately." Mrs. Hammond obeyed without a word, calling the staff into motion. The once silent mansion erupted into life. Julian turned to Angelina. "Come with me." She followed him through the corridors, never once removing her gloves or cloak, as if afraid that releasing her grip on reality might undo all she had fought to restore. In the nursery, the fire was already blazing by the time Julian laid Clara down upon the bed. The doctor was summoned. Hot cloths pressed against her forehead. Her clothes were removed and replaced with dry linens. Through it all, Angelina remained close, whispering to the child, holding her hand, refusing to let her drift beyond the sound of her voice. Only when Clara's fever broke, hours later, did Angelina finally allow herself to breathe. Julian stood behind her, leaning against the mantel. The firelight painted his face in shades of amber and sorrow. "You saved her," he said quietly. Angelina looked over her shoulder, her features weary but calm. "I only returned what never should have been taken." He took a step toward her, then another. "You shouldn't have come in this storm. You could have died." "I would have," she said, "if I hadn't brought her with me." A silence bloomed between them, thick with everything left unsaid. Julian's hand trembled slightly as he reached into his coat. From the inner pocket, he withdrew a folded document and held it out to her. "I received this today," he said. "From Whitcomb." Angelina unfolded the paper. It was the very same letter she had presented days earlier, now officially notarized, the false accusations crossed out and a brief note scrawled in the margin. "You win. She's yours. C.W." Her hands fell to her sides, the paper slipping to the floor. Julian looked at her, not as he once had, as a protector or employer, but as a man stripped bare, heart in hand, hope flickering in the shadow of despair. "I know what they tried to do," he said. "I know you faced them alone, that you fought for Clara and for me." Angelina's throat tightened. "I didn't do it for gratitude." "I know," he whispered. "That's why it means everything." From the doorway came the sound of shifting feet. Two men stood there, Mr. Alden and Mr. Sutherland, the estate's legal advisor, sent by the Whitcombs themselves to witness the removal of the child. Now they stood silent, wide-eyed, observing the girl safe in bed and her supposed oppressor humbled by the woman they had tried to destroy. Julian turned to them, his voice calm but firm. "I trust you've seen enough." Mr. Sutherland cleared his throat. "It appears there is no longer cause for concern. The court will be informed." "You may go," Julian said, his tone iron. The men departed without protest. When the door closed, Julian turned back to Angelina, stepping closer now, his expression trembling between awe and reverence. "You gave me back my daughter," he said, "but you gave me back something else too, something I had lost long before Eleanor died." Angelina said nothing. Her eyes shimmered with restrained emotion. "I told myself I would never love again," he continued. "That guilt had taken everything. That silence was safer than risking the heart again." He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "But you brought light into this house. You brought laughter back into Clara's eyes. You gave me your strength, your courage, your heart, even when mine was too broken to offer anything in return." Tears slipped down Angelina's cheeks. "I didn't mean to fall in love with this house, or with her, or with you." Julian brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. "But you did, and so did I." He pulled back slightly, his voice unsteady now. "I don't have grand words or polished declarations. I don't have a ring tonight, only this." He fell to one knee. Gaslight shimmered across the polished floor. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. "In the same room where I once buried every joy I knew, I ask you to be my joy now. Will you marry me, Angelina Hartwell?" Her breath left her. She looked around the music room, the place where shadows once lived, where sorrow once played its final notes. And now it pulsed with something entirely new. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Julian rose and kissed her, not with restraint, not with fear, but with reverent longing. It was not a kiss of conquest or hunger. It was a kiss of return, of belonging, of two souls that had been waiting for each other across time and grief and silence. Behind them, Clara stirred in her bed. And though her eyes remained closed, a smile spread across her lips. Later that night, after the storm had quieted, the Fairfax mansion stood bathed in golden light. Servants moved with reverent quiet, and in the music room, where pain had once reigned, love now whispered in every corner. The storm had come, and from it something stronger had emerged, not triumph, not victory, but a home reborn through truth, and a family finally whole. Spring arrived in New York like a long-awaited breath, slow, golden and fragrant with forgiveness. Trees lining Fifth Avenue blushed with delicate pink blossoms, and the city, once blanketed by storm and sorrow, stretched toward the sky in timid celebration. In the Fairfax mansion, the windows were thrown open for the first time in months, letting in the scent of new beginnings and the gentle hum of life returning to the world. The air inside was different now, lighter, warmer. In the grand parlor, polished wood gleamed beneath the morning light, and fresh flowers adorned the mantel in porcelain vases. Everything had been arranged with quiet elegance, not for a ball, not for a spectacle, but for a gathering of meaning. Angelina stood at the top of the staircase, dressed in a gown of soft ivory silk with pale lavender embroidery trailing the hem. The neckline was modest, the sleeves long, and yet she carried herself with a grace that needed no adornment. Her hair, coiled at the nape of her neck, was adorned with a simple comb of pearl and silver. She no longer walked like a guest. She walked like a woman at home. Mrs. Hammond waited at the foot of the stairs. When their eyes met, the housekeeper dipped her head, not stiffly, not as a duty, but with the reverence born of earned respect. "Good morning, Mrs. Fairfax," she said gently. Angelina smiled, soft and sincere. "Good morning, Mrs. Hammond." They stood for a moment in silence. Then the older woman added, "The guests have begun to arrive, and Miss Clara is asking for you." Angelina descended the stairs, each step filled with the serenity of a woman who had not merely survived scandal, exile, and loss, but had turned them into roots for something deeper. In the music room, now bathed in the tender light of midday, Clara sat at the piano bench with her small fingers poised above the keys. Her cheeks glowed with the vitality of spring, and her curls had grown longer, wilder. She looked up as Angelina entered and beamed. "Mamma, may I begin?" Angelina crossed the room and kissed her gently on the crown of her head. "Whenever you're ready." Clara began to play. The same melody Eleanor had once composed, the same piece Julian had played in sorrow, now filled the air with a gentler rhythm. It no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like remembrance. The guests, seated in clusters near the windows and by the fireplace, fell into silence. Friends, allies, and even a few wary acquaintances had come that day, uncertain of what to expect. They watched with quiet surprise as the child who had once been a silent ghost played with the ease of joy, and as the woman once dismissed by society stood radiant, not defiant, but complete. Julian entered from the hall, pausing to take in the sight. His waistcoat was charcoal grey, his hair brushed neatly back, though a silver streak now cut through his temple more visibly. Time had marked him, but not unkindly. He crossed the room to Angelina's side, resting his hand on her waist as the final notes lingered in the air. The applause was soft but genuine. Clara turned on the bench, flushed with pride, and ran to her father. He lifted her with ease and held her for a long moment. Then she whispered something in his ear, and he nodded, setting her down. "She wants to go play in the garden," he said to Angelina, smiling. "Shall we allow it?" "With her bonnet, yes," she replied. Mrs. Hammond appeared from the hall with the bonnet in hand, already anticipating the request. Julian raised his brows in quiet amusement. "She knows everything before we do," he murmured. Angelina smiled. "She always has." As Clara slipped out to the garden with her governess trailing behind her, the guests gradually followed, drawn to the promise of sunshine and orange blossoms. The music room was left in peaceful quiet, save for the tick of the clock and the soft creak of the piano stool as Angelina sat upon it. She traced her fingers over the keys, but did not play. Julian stood beside her, watching her with eyes full of memory. "Do you remember," he said softly, "the first time you entered this room?" "I do," she replied, lifting her gaze. "I remember thinking it was beautiful, but wounded." He crouched beside her, resting his hand gently over hers. It was. They sat in silence for a while, wrapped in that kind of intimacy that needed no touch to be felt. Julian exhaled, long and quiet. "When I saw you that night on the terrace, I told myself I was rescuing you." She looked at him, waiting. "But I wasn't," he continued. "You were never the one drowning. I was. In silence, in guilt, in ghosts. And then you came in like spring itself, and you saw everything. You didn't run." "No," she whispered, "because I saw the man who still wanted to live, who wanted to love but didn't know how anymore." He kissed the back of her hand, resting his brow there for a moment. "You saved me, Angelina. Not with grand gestures, with your presence, your strength, your refusal to give up on me, or her." She brushed his temple gently with her fingers. "You gave me a home, not just in walls, but in hearts. yours and Clara's. They stood, and she placed a hand over his chest. So, perhaps, she added, with a quiet smile, we saved each other. The afternoon continued, like a dream unfolding slowly. The garden behind the house bloomed with early roses and sweet-scented hyacinths. A table was set beneath the trellised arbor, where friends gathered for tea and quiet music. But as dusk began to fall and the lamps were lit one by one, a hush settled again inside the house. The ballroom doors were opened, not for spectacle, not for scandal, but for a dance. Angelina stood at the center of the marble floor, her gown catching the gold of the sconces, her eyes meeting Julian's across the room. He approached her slowly, deliberately, and extended his hand. "May I?" She took it. Always. And there, beneath the same chandeliers that had once witnessed whispers and judgment, they began to dance. No one watched with disdain. No one whispered. The music filled the room gently like a blessing, and with each step, each breath, they carved a new memory upon that floor, a memory of love that had survived shame, silence, and separation. Julian leaned close as they swayed. "Do you know what season it is, Mrs. Fairfax?" She tilted her head, smiling. "Spring." He shook his head softly. "No, it's summer." She looked around, surprised. "But the calendar—" He pressed his forehead to hers. "Not on paper, in my heart. This is the summer you gave me back, the one I thought I'd never feel again." Her eyes filled with quiet tears. "Then let it never end." As they danced, the room faded around them. Walls, guests, chandeliers. There was only the warmth of the music and the steady rhythm of two hearts finally aligned. No shadows followed them now, only light. And the knowledge that sometimes salvation does not come through rescue, but through the patient courage of loving someone back to life. The summer of 1901 arrived with a gentler sun and softer winds, as if even time itself had learned to move more tenderly. New York had grown taller, steel and ambition rising in towers that kissed the clouds. But within the heart of the Fairfax estate on the edge of Central Park, time had slowed, woven into the quiet rituals of family and memory. Angelina stood at the open window of the music room, her hands resting on the sill, worn smooth by years of morning sunlight. Her hair, once the soft chestnut of youth, now bore delicate streaks of silver that glimmered like threads of moonlight. She wore a pale blue muslin dress with lace at the cuffs, and a ribbon Clara had embroidered by hand. Outside, laughter echoed across the lawn. Julian's deep voice called out, a gentle, playful reprimand to a boy running barefoot over the trimmed hedges. The child responded with a squeal of mischief, and soon another joined him, a girl smaller but no less daring, chasing her brother with a ribbon streaming behind her like a comet tail. "They've taken your spirit," Angelina whispered to herself with a smile, and his eyes. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. Clara, now a young woman of 20, entered with a leather-bound portfolio beneath her arm. Her hair was still a cascade of golden curls, though now tied with grace, and her eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who had learned music not only from notes, but from life. "They've stolen Papa's hat again," Clara said with amusement, nodding toward the lawn. Angelina turned and laughed. "It's tradition now. Summer wouldn't begin without a stolen hat." Clara set her portfolio down gently and looked around the room. "I've finished the composition. Would you like to hear it?" Angelina approached, brushing a hand down her daughter's arm. "Always." As Clara sat at the piano, the room filled with the melody of years, echoes of Eleanor's sorrowful notes, the lullabies Angelina once hummed to calm Clara's cries, and the laughter that returned to this house one season at a time. The composition was new, but it carried every ghost with reverence, transforming memory into something living. When the final chord faded, Julian appeared in the doorway. He was older now, his beard tinged with white, his shoulders not quite as straight, but his eyes remained the same, storm-grey, steady and warm, when resting on his wife. "She plays with her soul," he said, "like her mother. Angelina turned, brushing a tear from her cheek. Like both of us. He walked to her, took her hand in his, and kissed it. The children are asking for a story under the willow tree. One about a laundress, a piano, and a storm. Angelina raised her brows. Again. They never tire of it, and neither do I. They stepped outside together, Clara joining them. The gardens had changed over the years, expanded, cultivated, but the old willow tree still stood by the fountain, its branches low and inviting. There, on a blanket, 2 children waited. Thomas, aged 9, and Eliza, just turned 7. "Tell the part when Mama threw snow in that horrible man's face," Eliza said, bouncing in place. "Tell the part when you cried in front of the lawyers," Thomas added with a grin. Julian chuckled. Such flattering memories. Angelina sat between them and rested her head on Julian's shoulder. "We'll tell you everything. But today, let's start with what came after the storm." Clara leaned against the trunk with her music book in her lap, listening. The world had changed. Society had softened somewhat. Women now spoke more freely in salons, and whispers of suffrage stirred even among Fifth Avenue's most rigid families. The Fairfaxes had quietly funded schools and charities across the city, though never under their own name. Angelina insisted that some good must rise from the fortune once built on silence. Mrs. Hammond had retired with dignity, receiving a pension that allowed her to live comfortably by the sea, where she wrote letters to Clara every Christmas. As for Robert Sinclair and the circle who once plotted Julian's fall, some fell into irrelevance, others into disgrace. The law had not punished them harshly, but time had. Their names faded from the newspapers and from memory, while the Fairfax name endured. Not with ostentation, but with quiet dignity, the kind that could not be bought or inherited, the kind that had been rebuilt from ashes. And what of the marriage that had begun in scandal and resistance? It endured. Julian still read poetry aloud on rainy days. Angelina still made her own jam every September. They danced, less often now and more slowly, but never once had they missed a wedding anniversary. Their love was not the fevered kind of youth, but a fire that had been tested by every season and still burned, low and steady. That night, as the children slept and the lamps were dimmed, Julian found Angelina in the music room once more. Clara had gone out to meet a young composer friend, and the house was quiet again. Julian took Angelina's hand and guided her to the middle of the room. "No music?" she asked. "Just this," he said, and he began to hum the tune Clara had composed that morning. They swayed gently, barefoot, as the moonlight spilled in silver patterns across the floor. Her head rested on his shoulder. His arms knew the shape of her by heart. "We're not who we once were," he whispered. "No," she said. "We're better." Outside, the city pulsed with electric lights and rising ambition, but within those walls, time paused for just a moment longer, long enough for a love that had been broken, tested, and mended to prove that not all things fade. Some stories do not end. They settle, soft as dust, sure as dawn, into the forever of those who lived them. Some stories are not just told. They are felt, lived, and remembered long after the final word. Angelina and Julian's journey reminds us that true love often arrives not in moments of perfection, but in the chaos of storms, in the silent strength of sacrifice, and in the courage to forgive. It teaches us that dignity is not defined by wealth or birth, but by the choices we make when the world turns its back on us. If you've made it this far, it means your heart beat with theirs. Through every injustice, every tear, and every whispered promise of hope. That's why I invite you to comment the word forever below, so I know you stood with them until the very end. And if this story touched you, please share it with someone who believes in second chances, or someone who might need to. Don't forget to check out the other stories I've left in the cards. They're filled with the same passion, the same triumph over adversity, and the same timeless charm that only a true historical romance can bring. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your presence here gives life to these stories. And remember, sometimes the most powerful love stories are not the loudest, but the ones that endure. From my heart to yours, until the next story.